Hello, my name is Sahara and this is my AP research project regarding vegan activism. So displayed on the screen are various images that depict certain movements happening in today's society. Although they are all pertaining to different causes, the moral message is the same. How can we use our voices to influence democracy for the better? Well, through activism. Activism allows us to do just that by establishing motives and methods that lead the way into coming up with solutions for everyday problems. With that being said, for my presentation, I wanted to focus on the specific factors that play a role in the effectiveness of activism, more specifically through gender. I found that there's no better activism events to have taken place in regards to gender than actual historical gender movements from history. Thus, I declared that to be my independent variable, if you will, and for that, I will be taking a separate activism movement and comparing and contrasting it to historical gender movements. So when actually coming up with what activism to compare and contrast it to with, I had to take into consideration what's an ongoing problem in today's society, what's going to continue to evolve, and I also had to make sure it wasn't biased in terms of gender, seeing as I'm comparing and contrasting it to historical gender movements. So this led me to vegan activism. I felt this was appropriate given that there's no bias gender-wise, and I can look at two different perspectives given the activism. This leads me to my actual research question, which is how do the differing motives and methods for vegan activism regarding men and women reflect those used historically in past gender movements? So first I will be talking about my methodology, which is what I decided to use in order to analyze my data and collect it so that I can effectively write my paper and create my presentation. So for this topic, I decided to go with a meta-analysis approach. What this basically means is I'm taking all of my sources, I'm kind of breaking it down into some subtopics, and then I'm pulling out specific pieces of evidence or reasoning that I can then use towards my gap. I found that this would be the most effective given that it's the most efficient and it would be the most organized. Since I'm looking at a very large variety of sources, I have to make sure all the information is very clearly set to me so that it's easier to actually write my paper and figure out what am I actually looking for within my gap. So regarding the actual sources that I'll be using, I decided to use the actual historical gender movements and then compare that to veganism. For the historical gender movements, I chose two from each gender, but for the purpose of this presentation, I will be pulling out one just for the sake of time. So now moving on to my literature review. This is the first step, which is women's historical movements. So the two that I focused on within my paper are women's suffrage and then abortion. For this actual presentation, I'll be focusing most importantly on women's suffrage. Then moving on to the men's historical movements, I have the mytho-poetic movement and the men's liberation movement. And for this presentation, I will be focusing on the mytho-poetic movement. Next, we have the veganism movements, and I'd like to clarify that regarding veganism, there's no specific movements that really took place, but rather an overarching theme that I noticed that was kind of overlapping within all the sources that I analyzed. So for example, for women, it was the ecofeminism movement, which has to do with women and nature as well as animal rights that I'll be going into later on. And then regarding the men veganism movements, all of them had to do something about masculinity through veganism. So they're just general subtopics, not actual movements, but just the main idea that I really want to focus on when identifying the gap and my reasoning for it. I'd also like to point out that I'm going to be using some key terms interchangeably. So men and women and male and female are used interchangeably, but they mean the same thing in the context of this presentation, as well as veganism and vegetarianism. So now for the data format, this is how it's going to be formatted on my Google Doc and when I took notes and when I looked through all the sources, and this is how I really organized it and just analyzed what I collected. So this is the table that's in my doc and all the categories that I have. So I have 5 columns on the top, the movement, methods, motives, opposition, and support. And then for the rows, it's just each movement. As you can see, there's 6 movements on screen, but for this presentation, I'm going through 4. So just to break it down a little bit further in regards to the columns, The movement is just a specific movement that's taking place. The methods are the specific tactics or strategies used by the organization in order to get their point across and really advocate for their cause. The motives are the reasoning behind the movement and the overall purpose. Opposition are any groups or specific people that do something in their power to try and prevent this cause from moving forward. Then the opposite, support, is groups or individuals that use their power in order to progress the cause forward or help it. So now I'm going to be breaking down my actual sources. So first off, we have the women's suffrage movement. This is concerned with the act of allowing women the right to vote. This took place around the 19th century and was actually influenced by the British suffrage movement. So regarding the motives for women's suffrage movement, it's pretty self-explanatory when you see it on the surface. They simply just want the right to vote. But it's honestly a lot deeper than that. It's about having a say in the decisions that take place in society. And not just that, there's a psychological standpoint about where do they think they fit in society? How are they playing a part in what's going on around them? And the people who really had a say in this were known as Quakers. These were middle-aged white women who were of middle class. And I'd like to read out a specific quote that highlights the psychological aspect. The Massachusetts Psychological Association, MPA, is organizing its 100th anniversary commemoration around the message that women's rights are fundamental to mental and physical health. I really wanted to hone in on this because I think it's heavily overlooked the mental impact that women's rights and activism deal with. Because on the surface, it's just, oh yes, they have rights now, they can vote. But it's so much deeper than that, and that has such a big impact later on when they're growing up, or the decisions that they'll make later on and the next generation to come. Regarding the methods, a lot of the methods that the women used were just rallying and big gatherings, and most importantly, word of mouth. A specific example was the Women's March on Washington. It started as a Facebook post, but it led in 5 million women gathering and just petitioning for women's suffrage and women's rights, and it got around super quick. I also want to point out that over time, the tactics the women's used got more aggressive over time, if that makes sense. Not in a violent way, but more as in a we are here and we're here to stay kind of way, and they really just wanted more attention brought to their cause. That's why they had big rallying and anything like that that would just cause the public to turn an eye onto them. As for the opposition, a common misconception is that those who oppose the women's suffrage movement are men. This is actually false. There was a lot of anti-suffragists that happened to be women. And on the screen is a chart that I took, and within the year 1895, there was actually a larger amount of female anti-suffragists than organized suffragists, which I just think is really important, especially for my research question, because it's not the opposing gender that naturally opposes the movement. It's so much more than that, which I think is really important. As for support, there was a lot of men who supported the movement and a mix of women, and a lot of them were abolitionists because they found that women suffragists heavily were advocating for abolition. So they had a lot of outside supporting groups, which definitely played a part into their cause. Next, I'm going to move on to the men's mythopoetic movement. So the men's mythopoetic movement was, honestly, it was a response to the women's movement. It was, the men had felt threatened by what the women were doing. They thought women were taking over. They were taking away their children. They weren't allowing men to have any say in the household. So they made a movement out of it. As for the motives, the movement was inspired by Iron John, a book by Robert Bly. Within his book, Bly emphasizes the importance of men finding the true masculinity within. This entire movement was a response to the granting of women's rights, and it also ended up being a trauma response to their upbringing. So for the methods, a lot of it was parallel to rituals that Native Americans would use. So they would do rituals, they would do prayers, they would do chants, anything like that. And they also had a specific method in which they would get on all fours and kind of howl and bark, almost mimicking that of wild animals, trying to find that masculinity and that kind of alpha within themselves. So the people who opposed this movement were naturally women because they thought they were just trying to undo everything that women had been fighting for. And as a response to this, a lot of literature was published, such as Backlash by Susan Faludi, and Women Respond to the Men's Movement. As for support, a key factor that I realized was the group who supported the movement, they tended to be white, heterosexual, male, middle class, and as I stated before, they had a trauma response growing up. What I mean by this is that their father figure when they were growing up simply was absent, or they just weren't present. And because of that, they felt like they could never be vulnerable with anyone or really in touch with their own emotions. And because of that, they found themselves in the mythopoetic movement amongst other men who didn't have that father figure, and they just simply wanted an outlet to let out their true emotions. Next, I'll be moving on to the women's veganism movement. As I stated before, I'll be focusing on ecofeminism. Ecofeminism combines a few ideas, but the most basic ones are nature, women's rights, and then animal rights. When I chose this topic, I had no background information from it. It simply just tended to always kind of come up when I was researching, which I just thought was very interesting to this topic. So, as for the motives for ecofeminism, the motives were simply, they wanted animal rights. They had empathy towards animals, and they wanted to save their lives. That was a basic motive. And a key word that came up continuously was the word empathy. It was about emotions, it was about feelings. It was about putting themselves in the shoes of animals and knowing what it's right to not have rights. As I explained in the women's movement, they kind of felt how it was to be overlooked, to not have a say in what's going on. So they found that within the animals. The animals have no say in what's happening to them. They don't know if they're going to be killed or slaughtered. So they found that comparison within themselves, and they used that in order to push forward with the cause. The methods that they would do are usually propaganda that would provoke empathy from audiences. For example, there would be commercials or ads for veganism, and it would be a woman holding, let's say, a bunny, or a bunch of animals looking happy and like running around freely in a yard. All this evokes empathy because they want the audience to think, oh wow, that's a cute animal, or oh wow, that woman's posing with that animal. That's really cute. It was all about the emotions or the feelings. Or they would take the other route and post graphic images of animals being slaughtered because they wanted people to see that and think, wow, that's really sad, that's really scary. They wanted the emotional aspect to come out of veganism. For the opposition, the people who opposed this movement tended to be men or just anyone that really didn't have that empathetic aspect. It would be people who overlooked empathy and kind of saw it from a bigger picture. They didn't see the animals' rights. They saw, oh, well, what about the businesses that are going to be affected by this? Or what about my own health? How am I benefiting from eating meat? They didn't see it from the animals' rights. They saw it from a bigger perspective that was more than that. And from a supporting side, some people supported this movement, as I said, people who were empathetic. But what I really noticed was that when there happened to be that few amount of men who actually supported the movement, they would kind of overshadow what it was all about. As the quote on the board says, I guess it's because whenever anything is given credibility, unfortunately it is usually led by a man, or man is in the starring role. What this basically means is that a woman could be leading a movement, and then as soon as a man kind of steps in the way and starts advocating for them, it would seem as if they're helping them, right? But in the end, it would kind of become more about the man itself and not the cause that was there to begin with, which was a problematic thing that just kept occurring. Next, we lastly have men's veganism. Men's veganism tended to be the complete opposite from women's. It was about health, it was about benefits. How can I feel better, look better through veganism, rather than how is this affecting the animals? As for the motives, as I said, it was just from a health standpoint. They would think, okay, what can I eat? How is this helping me if I cut out meat from my diet? Nothing about it was, okay, how is this benefiting the animals, the industries? It was just from a healthy aspect. As for the methods, a lot of it would be commercials. As I said, for women, they did commercials about women holding animals or like evoking that empathy. But for the methods for men, it would be commercials that would show maybe a lean body or a guy posing and saying, or nutritional information. It would be about that, not an emotional aspect, but a logistical aspect. As for opposition, there was a few amount of men who are actually vegan. That's the one thing that I really pulled out from this. The majority of vegan people are women. And so in the few percent of men who are vegan, why are they vegan? Why did they choose to follow that lifestyle? A lot of it was because they wanted to find that new masculinity within, or as I said, the health benefits. But because of that, the opposition was that other men would see them as soft, as not masculine, as more feminine. Because of that, men are they feel as if they're weak if they do convert to veganism. They feel judged by other men, which is why there's such a few amount of men who are actually vegan, because they're scared of what others might think. As for support, there's a very few amount that support this new veganism or new lifestyle or this new masculinity. But as I said before, it's a very small percentage, and it's mostly those who don't really care about what other people think. So now I'm going to finally analyze my takeaways and observations. So for men, the main motives that I took away from this are masculinity. Within the historical gender movements, masculinity was a reoccurring theme. As we saw in the mythopoetic movement, their whole thing was finding that inner alpha and those true emotions. The same thing we can see in the veganism movement. They didn't make anything about it about animal rights. They made it about themselves. How can they benefit from this health-wise? How can they become new masculinity? Justification. For each movement, they found some reasoning to justify their cause. For the mythopoetic movement, it's because they didn't have a father figure, they didn't have an outlet. For veganism, they justified it with their own health aspects. They focused on how it would benefit themselves rather than the actual cause that they're fighting for in the first place. For the methods, it was morally the same between media and news, and they also used ridicule. Those who didn't follow kind of the crowd were made fun of or judged by others, and this played a part in who actually followed it, and that's why there's such a small amount of men that are actually vegan. As for the takeaways and observations through women, the reflections I noticed in terms of motives were oppression. For the women's historical movements, the women's suffrage, the whole thing was about not having rights, not having a say. This has to do with oppression, always being dominated by men. The same thing we could see in the women's veganism when they were fighting for veganism. It was about oppression. They saw themselves as the animal, and the oppressor was those who eat meat or those who kill the animals. They put themselves in the shoes of the animals and use that to relate to their own experiences in order to advocate for their cause. For the methods, again, they use media and books. Finding that crowd or getting a lot of voices, that's a reoccurring theme that we always see. And the mental aspect. I mentioned before the psychological aspect of women having rights. The same thing could be said with the women's veganism. They see it from a mental aspect through the animals' lives. So, in conclusion, we can really see how there's a lot of reflections from the historical gender movement to veganism movements. And there's a lot of recurring themes from masculinity to nurturing, and how this has been evolving over the years, but a lot of the same aspects have remained the exact same no matter what the cause is. That was the true gap that I really wanted to identify, even though I took a cause that has really nothing to do with gender, but I found a way to make it about gender through underlying reasoning. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Okay. What was the most important source of information you found while conducting your research for your methodology, and why was it important to your research process?
I think the most important research that I found was regarding, I would say, both the women's movement, ecofeminism movement, and then the men's mythopoetic movement. I found one source that really highlighted the masculinity and the nurturing. As I said before, those were the two main takeaways I took from this, and I found that to just be really reoccurring. A lot of it would be about asserting dominance, and the other one would be about women really provoking emotion, and I think that's what I really wanted to tap in on when I was talking about my gap, because that's the most important thing that played a part into my research.
Thank you.
Okay. What additional questions emerged during your research? Based upon your recent experience, what advice would you give to other researchers who might choose to investigate those questions?
Some further questioning that I think kind of arrived was, I think, how gender plays a part in other aspects outside of activism. I feel like there's a lot of different perspectives that we can see, or what I'm trying to say is more specifically through activism, maybe specific movements that take place, or looking at it from a political aspect. And I think people who want to kind of question that, I would do it from a conducting an experiment approach. For me, I kind of analyzed research, but I think to really find out relevant data, I would do research today and see in today's society, how are people responding to it? Because a lot of this was based off historical research, and yes, some of it was taken from today, but as today's world is progressing and so many things are kind of just happening around us, I think it's going to continue to change, so it's definitely something to take a look at.
What part of the research process did you find the easiest? Was this something you were anticipating to be easy?
The easiest part of my research process was analyzing the historical gender movements. I was expecting this to be the easiest part given that women's suffrage, abortion, or anything like that, it was kind of well known, and I had learned about it in my own U.S. history classes. So I was expecting this to be easy, especially since it's been analyzed so much more deeply now in today's world. I feel like there's a lot of sources where they really pick out certain tactics that were used, and I really utilized this because that was kind of what my whole research question was about. So I think that was definitely the easiest.
Okay, thank you. Oh, do we have